my speech is going to be about sexuality in marriage over the centuries. So I added some vocabulary to the Google document. There isn't anything very tricky. There aren't lots of figures really. So it should be okay. I think I timed it. I think it's about 6 or 7 minutes. If it's longer than that, I can cut a bit off the end, but that's basically it. And I'm ready to get started whenever you want. So without further ado, I'll get into the speech. Ladies and gentlemen, like many people dealing with the current confinement situation, I've been looking for things to do to keep myself occupied. And in the end, I decided to go catch up on some homework. You see, I recently added Croatian as a working language. And so I have a stash of Croatian language material from when I was attending class. Now that I'm under confinement, I finally have the time to go through the material from those classes. And in doing so, I found a very interesting article about sexuality within marriage over the centuries. And I'm going to share some parts of the article with you today. Now, when it comes to sexuality, there have long been rules about what's acceptable within marriage. In the Middle Ages, women were expected to behave in a way that would avoid drawing men's attention. Therefore, women had to control their own behavior because men's behavior was subject to very little control. And I'll give you an example. Let's look at the behavior of knights. They were far from chivalrous. To knights, women were merely objects to satisfy their sexual desires. So knights often kidnapped and indeed raped women. And to give you an idea of the general view that the elite held of women, we can look at a book written in 1187 by the French author André Le Chapelain. This was a rule book for knightly love called De Amore. In this book, Le Chapelain explained that not all women were worthy of respect, only those from the upper classes, and that there was no need to waste one's romantic feelings on lower class women because lower class women only existed for physical pleasure. So this meant that only upper class women were worthy of a knight, and the fight for such women was often to the death. This led to women being viewed as responsible for all evils. For example, women in castles were kept under close surveillance. They were often isolated in their own chambers until their wedding day, when they were then handed over to the husband chosen for her by her parents. And in fact, much of the language used in a modern wedding evokes the customs of the Middle Ages. We say that the father of the bride gives her away, which was literally the case centuries ago. We also say that the bridegroom takes the bride as his wife, which could also conjure up images of a knight physically taking a woman to make her his wife. And around the same time in the 12th century, the church started to get involved. Marriage became a holy sacrament, which required consummation for the marriage to be recognized. In many parts of Europe, the newlyweds were granted very little privacy on their first night. Friends and family would escort the newlyweds into the bedroom, and when the doors were closed, they would eavesdrop outside the door to see if the newlyweds lived up to expectations. The wedding festivities would continue unabated, with the couple being the butt of lewd jokes and obscene songs. And then the next morning, the husband would bring a gift to his wife in compensation for taking her virginity. And family members would even check the bed sheets for bloodstains that were believed to prove the wife had been a virgin. It would only be at the end of the 18th century, when the honeymoon was introduced, that newlyweds would finally begin to have some privacy on their first night together. Now, Having spoken a little about wedding customs, I'd just like to talk about sexuality within marriage, from the Middle Ages. Let's see, in 12th century England, the church began to impose restrictions on when people could have sex. Now get ready, there's a whole list of restrictions. For example, sex was banned on Thursdays in memory of Christ's captivity, on Fridays in memory of Christ's death, on Saturdays in honor of the Virgin Mary, on Sundays in remembrance of Jesus' resurrection, and on Mondays for the souls of the dead. Sex was also forbidden on All Saints' Day, at Christmas, during Lent, on days of fasting, on feast days, 40 days after giving birth, and during menstruation. So you can see, obviously, a strictly observing couple could almost never have had sexual relations. But not only did the church try to restrict when people could do it, but also how they did it. The church only approved one position, because in the church's opinion, men were naturally active and women were naturally passive. So it was only natural for the man to be on top. All other positions were considered unnatural because they would give the participants unnecessary pleasure, and the more canino, you might guess what that is, being particularly frowned upon. The pleasure obtained from any such position was considered the worst kind of sin. Now I see that I'm approaching 6 minutes in my speech, so I'll move on to my conclusion, which is to say that, well, society has come a long way in the intervening centuries, but it is interesting to see what customs have remained and what has changed. I'm sure I'm not the only one who thinks it's a good idea that the honeymoon was invented to bring a bit of privacy for newlyweds, so that what happens in the bedroom will stay in the bedroom. Thank you for your attention.